Okay, so I've decided on reading a book by one of my favourite authors, like listening to an audiobook that is, by one of my favourite authors. He's, he writes a lot of historical fiction under the name Christian Cameron, and it's really good stuff. But I'm listening to the first book in the only fantasy series that he's written, which is called the Traitor Son Cycle, the whole series. But the first book is called The Red Knight. Like I say, it's a high fantasy, massive cast of characters, you know, epic proportions, multiple points of view, like the whole shebang. There's 5 books in the series in total, and they're all pretty big. But I have read this series before. I really enjoyed it the first time I read it, so I'm looking forward to seeing how it translates to audiobook. So the story focuses around a mercenary company led by their captain, the Red Knight, who's got this like mysterious past. They get employed to basically act as like garrison troops and monster hunters for this abbey in the far north of the kingdom in this fantasy world. It's a fantasy world that's got a very sort of high medieval setting, and it takes a lot of influences from history. There's the major religion is basically Christianity with a few slight tweaks, even though there is magic and stuff involved. A lot of the names of people and places are taken directly from history. Another thing that heavily influences this series is the legends of King Arthur. There's all kinds of links there that if you're interested in that, you can keep an eye out for, and that's quite a fun little sort of side thing. So yeah, this is a book and a series in general that really subverts the, traditional ideas of heroes, good guys, bad guys. All of the protagonists, are kind of anti-heroes, really. They're all very morally ambiguous. A lot of them are from this mercenary company. They're very hard-bitten. They've got tons of vices, So even though these guys are the protagonists, they're the people we're supposed to be rooting for, it's not necessarily clear whether all of their motives and all of their actions are particularly good in a normal sense. Equally, the people who we are supposed to, the antagonists, it's very interesting. It's a concept called the wild, which is basically in this world you've got civilization, and then at the edge of civilization there's the wild, which is inhabited by like monsters, and it's like deep forest, and people have to reclaim land from it to expand human civilization. And so our main protagonists are fighting against the sort of what ends up being the sort of massed forces of the wild, but they're not evil. They're just out for their own survival just as much as people are. So it's a question of who you root for, and nobody's a good guy, nobody's the bad guy. You've just got two opposing forces coming into conflict. So one of the things that Miles Cameron, does really well is his character work is fantastic. He provides all of his characters with like brilliantly in-depth motivations that are completely realistic and human, and it doesn't matter whether they're like major characters, minor characters, whatever. They've all got their own agenda, and it may be that those agendas combine with other people's, it may not, but it's always changing as well. You've got to really keep on top of everything that goes up towards making these characters' personalities, because it will affect their decisions and their actions. So yeah, like I say, a really big cast of characters, and there's really something for everyone here. You know, you've got everyone from the king and the queen up the top down to nobility. You've got merchants, you've got the working class and the peasant class as well. Male characters, female characters, you've got non-human characters, the whole lot really. And yet, in spite of this being a really medieval inspired setting, there are a number of quite significant differences really. One is the role of women within society. There's a lot of really powerful and really well-rounded women characters in this novel, and they're integrated into all sorts of levels and all sorts of professions in society. And on top of that, you know, although religion and this basically Christian religion is pretty much prevalent throughout all of the areas that we're involved in the book, you know, atheism and the ability to question that belief is not frowned upon in anywhere near the same way as it would have been in the actual medieval period. So that leads to some, you know, both of those things lead to some really interesting dynamics between the characters as well. Right, so if you watched my last audiobook vlog that I did about Game of Thrones, you'll have seen that I started setting up this bit of wood carving that I'm going to do. So I cut the board to the right size and got it to the right thickness, and I've drawn on the design. You can see it's just a stylised bear with some Celtic knotwork around the border. So now I'm going to get started on that while I'm listening to a bunch of the Red Knight. Okay, so I've roughed out the border. That's like the fiddliest, most time consuming bit. Yeah, the rest of it should be like relatively easy, although it's still going to take a lot of time. Okay, so the Red Knight audiobook has been split into 4 parts. I've just reached the end of the first part, and it's really enjoyable to get back into this world, to be honest. It's a slightly slow start to the novel, but I quite like when you're dealing with epic fantasy, I think it's important to have a slightly slower paced start, especially when you've got such a big cast of characters, because you need that time to get to know the world and get to know the characters a bit before you're thrust immediately into the action. And that is something that Miles Cameron has done really well in the first sort of quarter of this book. And anyway, the carving's coming on pretty well. I've done most of the setting in work now. I've just got to do the interior of the Celtic knotwork, which it shouldn't take too long. Then it's just a bit of fine detail work, like doing all the sort of curves in the bears and doing the bear and doing the corner plaques as well. And then that'll be ready to, you know, oil or varnish, or I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to finish it yet, but yeah, another few hours work there, and I should be able to get through the rest of the Red Knight while I'm doing that. Yes, as I say, the sort of inciting incident of the story is, or the premise, is that this hard-bitten mercenary company is hired by a convent, a nunnery, a fortified nunnery, to help prevent the attacks on the surrounding area by creatures of the wild. And they sort of think that initially it's just like one creature from the wild who is committing these attacks, but as the book goes on, it turns out to be a far bigger threat. It turns out to be a threat, in fact, that not only threatens the monastery but also the entire realm. And you know, so it escalates into a much wider conflict. And initially, this conflict is just between, you know, humanity and the wild. But as we go on, you start to see that it's much more nuanced than that. There are elements of the wild who are so, for example, the magic system in this book, which he doesn't go into too much depth explaining it in this novel. There is more in the later in the series, but you can get power from the green or from the gold, and the green is the wild and the magic that the wild uses, and this is within the sort of religion of the Christian religion of the Kingdom of Alba is Satan's magic. And then you get the gold, which magic comes from the sun, and that is the magic that sort of people use. But as you go on, you find out that there are people who are using this green magic, and they're not evil people or anything. They're actually they're actually some of the, I guess, some of the most sort of good characters. I mean, as I say, this is a very morally grey novel, but yeah, some of the most good characters use this green magic. Also, you get elements of the humans fighting with the wild. You have people who they're called outwallers who live in the wild. So obviously it's not just humanity against the wild. It is, in fact, it's more like civilization against the wild, and you get humans who reject civilization as well, or reject the type of civilization that is portrayed in this one anyway. With strict governmental structures and laws and stuff like that, and the outwallers have more of a sort of tribal, clan-based society. You also get these people called Jacks, who are they're rebels, rebels against the crown of the Kingdom of Alba. And they fight with the wild as well. So yeah, the conflict does become a lot more nuanced than just people against monsters, and also the morality of it. Yeah, the morality of this series, very ambiguous, raises a lot of questions. You've got this hard-bitten mercenary company who are protecting a convent, and that leads to some really interesting moral questions being raised. Because a lot of these mercenaries, they might be murderers or thieves or rapists or whatever, and they're living alongside nuns. And Cameron, he doesn't skirt around these questions. He hits them head on, and yeah, he gives you all the sides of all these sort of moral dilemmas. He's not preachy or anything like that. He's not saying this is right and this is wrong. He's like, this is how this person looks at it, this is how this other character looks at it. You make up your own mind as to what's right or wrong about this situation. Okay, so this is where I'm at with the carving at the end of the Red Knight audiobook. I've done all of the border, I've done all the setting in around the bear, I've sorted the background out, I've done the bottom right corner plaque, so it's just the detail work on the bear and the top left corner plaque to do, but I didn't get round to that before I finished the audiobook. But yeah, final thoughts on The Red Knight then. I absolutely loved this book the first time I read it. I thought it was something really original in the genre. His Miles Cameron's writing style is something that you don't see very often in the fantasy genre. He's got that military experience, and also his knowledge of history, strategy, tactics that makes his battle scenes some of the absolute best that I've ever read in any genre, not just fantasy. He writes historical fiction as well, like I said, and it's the same in his historical fiction books. He does reenactments, so he really knows what it feels like to be in those situations, at least as much as it is possible to, anyway. His character work, as I've said, is up there with the best. The nuance and the sort of three-dimensional, fleshed out nature of the characters and the overall conflict of the book is really up there. Great stuff. But yeah, I don't hear many people talking about this book. I've seen one or two people on YouTube who have read this book, reviewed it, and it has got across the board really good reviews, and I would back that up as well. I've read the physical book, I've listened to the audiobook, they were both great, and for me this is a hugely underrated fantasy series. So if you like epic fantasy, then I would absolutely suggest that you get out and buy yourself a copy of The Red Knight by Miles Cameron, first book in the Traitor Son Cycle. It's up there in my probably top 5 fantasy series of all time, I would say. So yeah, hope you enjoyed that, hope it was useful. Yeah, if you have read this book, then please let me know. I'd love to talk about it with anyone who's read it. But I literally haven't met anyone that's read it. I recommend it to a bunch of people, like my brother included. He still hasn't got around to reading it, or if he has, he hasn't told me. So yeah, if anyone has, let me know. And bye.